Hi, AP Environmental. It is me, Mrs. Willis, and I'm here to talk to you about all the different types of renewable energy that exist in our world. So let's go ahead and go through them. Our first renewable energy source that we're going to talk about is solar energy. There are actually two types of solar heating that can take place with solar energy. The first one being passive solar heating. And this is where architects or engineers, they use special materials in the designing of the house to accommodate for an increased amount of sun energy and to be able to use that in the house. So some of the things that engineers have designed are these things called trombe walls, which absorb solar energy and store it for the house. You have eaves, things that kind of hang over the house. Water heaters are a good example of solar heating, especially if you have them out in the direct way of sunlight. And of course, solar cookers. You are harnessing that energy to cook food. Compare that with active solar heating. In this process, you actually have to use a little bit of energy to kind of harness the benefits of the solar heating. So a prime example of an active solar heater would be a photovoltaic cell, or a PV cell for short. PV cells are used for the generation of electricity. And what happens here is solar energy, it hits the PV cell that you have obviously placed in the direct sunlight. And when that hits those cells, those wafers, usually it creates some sort of small electrical current based upon the material that's in the wafer. Usually it is silicone, the element silicone. And so when the sunlight hits that element, it excites the electrons, and then you can harness those electrons in a wire, which generates obviously the movement of electrons, which is essentially electricity. There are a couple of words you should know with PV cells. Number one, of course, if you're talking about just an individual unit, it's called a cell. When you put the cells together, you get what's called a module. And when you put a whole bunch of modules together, you get what's called an array. So usually when you see these on people's houses, like on their roofs, they have a photovoltaic array. So they have a lot of modules connected together, and then of course connected to their electricity source. Also, there are different types of photovoltaic systems that you can put in your house. So you can have photovoltaics on your roof and then have them connected to the city's electrical grid, or the electrical lines that are coming and going essentially from the city. Or you could have a standalone PV system, but if you do have one of those, please note that you can only generate electricity when the sun is present. If you want to be able to store that electricity that's being generated from the PV panels, you need to connect it to a storage device. And oftentimes what is used to store the electricity is a battery. So if you're a standalone system off the grid, away in the desert, you're going to need to have some sort of storage battery to be able to store the solar energy and use it when the sun isn't present. Another way that you can actively harness the sun energy is through the use of a solar tower. If you've ever driven out to Vegas off the 15 freeway, you have seen these before. There is one in the desert. What you see is in the middle, there's a tower, and then around it are a whole bunch of mirrors, and the mirrors are angled to go directly to the tower in the middle. What's in that tower? There's usually some sort of fluid that gets superheated, and when it gets heated, they can use it to obviously heat up steam and spin a turbine and generate electricity that way. As with any energy source, there are advantages and disadvantages to using that source. So for solar energy, some of the good things are is that number one, yes, it is renewable and the sun will continue to shine and we don't have to worry about it running out. It is abundant, especially in certain places of the world. You do get high concentrations of sunlight. It also allows for people to have control over their electricity, so they don't have to rely on a city system or a grid system or some centralized system of electricity in order to be able to generate their own electricity. And of course, when you're operating a PV cell or things like that, they tend not to create greenhouse gas emissions. That's not the case when you're talking about building of a photovoltaic cell, for example, because obviously in the manufacturing process, you're going to release some greenhouse gases, but in the operation of them, there are no greenhouse gas emissions. The bad things, well, as you know, some places don't receive as much sunlight, so this wouldn't be something you could use, for example, in, let's say, Antarctica. And then it is rather expensive to start off. So if you wanted to put these on the roof of your house, it can be quite pricey. Our second renewable energy resource is wind. Wind energy tends to be harnessed by these giant wind turbines. So you get the wind to basically spin the turbine, and when it spins the turbine, there's a generator inside the head of that turbine that will usually generate electricity. They come in a variety of numbers and ranges. Ultimately, you want to put them in areas where there's high concentrations of wind. And you obviously, the more that you place there, just like with PV cells, the more electricity you are going to generate. If you've ever driven out to Palm Springs, you have definitely seen wind turbines off of the 10 freeway. And these are giant clusters. There's hundreds of these wind turbines that are placed out there because it does get high concentrations of wind. There are also wind turbines that can be found in the ocean. So if you go into some Scandinavian countries up north, you will see that they have placed wind turbines in the water because you do get winds being created from the oceans. What are some good things and bad things about wind power? Again, it is renewable as long as the wind is blowing. You do not have any greenhouse gas emissions from the operation of the equipment. Again, it allows you to kind of control your own electricity. And then the cost tends to be low after the initial investment of buying the turbine, which can be kind of pricey. The downside is that you just don't find wind everywhere, and it does have to be a relatively strong concentration of wind to get those turbines to move. The windy sites can be far away from where people live, so you would have to connect a long series of electrical power lines to get to those population centers. There have been reports that the wind turbines do kill birds and they do kill bats when they enter into that area. And of course, to be able to make clusters of, for example, 200 wind turbines, it is pretty pricey. Our third renewable energy resource is hydroelectric power, which is water power. Hydroelectric power is usually harnessed through the operation of a dam. So what you do is you build kind of like a concrete wall across the river and you back up the river. The river starts to flood behind the dam, of course, and that's what we call the reservoir. And then hydroelectric engineers will allow water to run through the dam at given points in time. When they run the water through the dam, they get that water to spin a turbine that can generate electricity. A lot of the world's power does come from hydroelectric power. The current biggest dam that exists in the world is the Three Gorges Dam that exists in China on the Yangtze River. And this dam is approximately a mile in length, but it does generate a lot of electricity to the people around the area. And if you just take a look at this picture here, if you look to the right, you can see the gigantic reservoir that was created from this dam. A very large dam that exists here in the United States is the Hoover Dam, and this can be found along the Colorado River. Some of you might have actually been there, and it's about an hour out of Las Vegas, but you can go there, you can take a tour, and you can definitely see the turbines that are spinning from the release of that water behind the dam. So one of the negative things about a dam is that it does potentially block migration of fish. Some species of fish, like salmon or trout, steelhead trout, they like to return back to the river that they were born in to lay their eggs and obviously reproduce and populate their populations. However, if you put a dam in the river that they return to, they can't get upstream to lay their eggs. So what engineers have created is what's called a fish ladder, where the fish actually hop up and over, if you want to think about it that way, to the reservoir so that they can go return to their breeding sites, lay their eggs, and of course repopulate. Some of the good things about dams is that pretty much after you dam the river, you can control it. So for example, you can divert the water to maybe farms or irrigation that need that water. You can also maybe divert the water to areas like Los Angeles who are drought stricken pretty much all the time. You can also control flooding. So anything that's downstream to that dam will now not have to worry about flooding issues because you're blocking the flow of that water. The negative thing is that sediments tend to travel downstream, and when you put a big wall of cement in the river, those sediments that are full of nutrients can't go downstream anymore. So you've blocked the flow of nutrients that go downstream. Also, like you saw on the last thing, it can hamper with the migration of fish who travel upstream. Because you have a giant pool of water that's sitting behind a dam, you can obviously get increased levels of bacterial growth in the water. You can also have stagnant water, so that increases the breeding grounds for things like mosquitoes, who can carry really deadly diseases that can make people really sick. Another type of water power that can be generated is wave or tidal energy. And in this renewable energy source, you set up a turbine that harnesses the energy of the waves, and then you use that to spin the turbines to generate electricity. But again, you need to place them in areas that get consistent wave or tidal energy. Some of the good things about wave power is that it can be consistent. Pretty much waves happen all the time. It doesn't create any air pollution in its operation, and it can be pretty efficient in harnessing the energy. The bad thing is, though, that you're placing these devices in salt water, and so that can lead to easy breakdown of machines. It could harm marine life, or it could interfere with their habitat, and they are pretty pricey to install. Geothermal is our next renewable energy resource. And in geothermal energy, we take the energy that is being created usually from superheated water from sources underneath the ground. So underneath the ground, it tends to be pretty hot. And of course, you can heat up any sort of water that's underneath the ground, and that steam will be brought to the surface. And then of course you can use that superheated water to spin a turbine to generate electricity. And then of course, to make sure that it's renewable, usually the water is returned back into the ground. Here in the United States, you can find geothermal energy in Yellowstone National Park. So that is sitting on top of a giant hotspot in the North American plate. And as that heat is rising, it superheats any water that may be in the ground. And of course, that superheated water escapes through what we call geysers. An advantage to using geothermal energy would be that when the plant is in operation, there are very low carbon dioxide emissions. And it also tends to be relatively small in operation. So you're not going to see these huge power plants on geothermal land. So it's relatively low habitat loss for organisms. Some of the bad things, well, of course, you can't find geothermal energy everywhere. You can only find it in certain places of the world, like Iceland or, of course, Yellowstone. And it can be depleted if you're not regulating how much water you're putting back into the ground. There is some noise pollution with it. It tends to be pretty noisy, and there is some odor pollution associated with it because you are pulling things from underneath the ground. One of the stink factors is through the release of hydrogen sulfide, which smells like rotten eggs. So again, good things and bad things for both sides. I'm throwing in fuel cells here, even though the use of hydrogen in this example can and can't be renewable. So it needs to be monitored in order to be a renewable energy source. A fuel cell is a device that you can place in transportation methods. And what it does is it takes hydrogen that you put in the car. So you do have to insert hydrogen into the car, and it mixes it with oxygen that's already in the atmosphere. And with this device, it actually takes the two, combines them. But as it does that, it obviously harnesses the electrons from those two atoms to generate electricity. So essentially, a fuel cell car is an electric car, but you're taking those electrons from the hydrogen that you're putting into the car. What's great is that after it runs through that fuel cell membrane, the hydrogen and oxygen combine, and so the only byproduct that you get from this fuel cell operation is water, H2O, and of course a little bit of heat. With fuel cell cars, one of the great things is that there's really no air pollution. When you see the tailpipe of a fuel cell car, all you're going to see that comes out of there is water. They tend to be quieter, so that's always nice when we talk about noise pollution, and the fuel cell tends to be pretty efficient. However, when we're talking about the negatives, one of the big things is that fuel cells are very expensive still. And so a lot of people can't afford to buy a fuel cell car, even though they are coming out on the market, like the Toyota Mirai. Also, hydrogen, super explosive. And so it may be a little dangerous to be carrying around hydrogen tanks in our car because if there is an accident, they could explode. Our last renewable energy source that we're going to talk about is biomass. And what is biomass? It's organic matter that has been created from primary producers. So it's living material, it has a weight. And of course, if you wanted to know what is the biomass of each trophic level, like the primary producers, you would dry it out and of course weigh it to see how much it actually is. There are two different ways of using biomass energy. In both of these ways, you have to be careful that whatever you are harvesting, so if you're harvesting vegetation for this, that you have to make sure that you're replanting the same amount of stuff that you're harvesting. That's how you truly can make it renewable and sustainable. If you're taking out more than can be replaced, then this isn't going to be a renewable energy source. So the first thing that you can do is just burn it. And when you burn it, you can create heat. The second thing that you can do is you can create biofuels from it. So the two very common biofuels that are created from biomass are methanol and ethanol. And some people do use these as their fuel source for their cars. So the process of bioconversion is taking biomass and turning it into something that we can use. So for biomass burning, here in the United States, you can actually take that to generate electricity. So again, you would burn it, you would run water pipes through that for the steam to spin a turbine to generate electricity. However, you could convert your biomass into alcohols, for example, through a process called fermentation. And with that, you could create methanol and ethanol. So there are different ways to use the biomass. Some of the great things about biomass is that it tends to be inexpensive. You just have to have plants or grow plants. Some of the waste that is being generated can actually be used for energy. So you can burn it to generate electricity. Also, if we're talking about the breakdown of materials with biomass, we can try to capture some of that methane that's usually just naturally produced by bacteria. And by capturing that methane that is created, we can reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The negatives, of course, when you burn it, it does release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Sometimes people won't harvest biomass for sustainable purposes, so it could lead to deforestation or cutting down all the trees. And then lastly, there is competition. If you're growing, for example, corn to be fermented to make ethanol, that's going to be competing with the corn that goes towards people's mouths for food. So just something to think about. All right, everyone, that concludes our renewable energy talk. I hope you hung in there. I am so sorry. Have a great day.